When you think of the year 2024, what comes to mind? What our news partners statewide thought were some of their best stories of the past year. That's today on the Texas Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm David Brown. We often talk about our partners in public media stations across the Lone Star State who, unlike reporters who parachute in when there's breaking news, live and breathe the Texas we cover every day. It gives their stories a richness, authenticity, and depth that's unique on the radio and in journalism more broadly. Together, those reporting partners are known as the Texas Newsroom, and today we'll be hearing some of the most memorable stories and sounds they brought us this past year. Our special edition of the Texas Standard gets underway right after this. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this 23rd day of December, or as we call it around our place, Christmas Eve. A children's plot to open a few gifts early, no doubt. Not gonna happen. Thanks so much for joining us. 'Tis the season for looking back at the year that was, and this hour we're looking at 2024 through the lens of reporting by our partner stations who collaborate with us under the auspices of the Texas Newsroom, the collective name for that partnership of public media outlets statewide. To help us with our journalistic waltz across Texas this hour, Osier Lindley, senior editor for the Texas Newsroom. Rachel, welcome.
Hey, thanks, David. Happy to be back on the show.
Great to have you. As folks often hear on our program, we're a collaboration between public radio stations across Texas. And as the senior editor helping to manage content from all those newsrooms, what does that look like in the real world?
Well, David, between our station newsrooms in Texas, we have around 120 public media journalists spread out across the state. Kind of an unbelievable number. And our main goal is to operate like one big statewide newsroom. So as you can imagine, that involves a lot of communication. Editors from all of our stations meet every morning to talk about what's happening in Texas and who's covering it. And then for me personally, that leads to a lot of follow-up conversations with editors and reporters. And the Texas... Yeah, a lot of it. The Texas Newsroom's editors, we also help with future planning and editorial support. So my colleagues and I will regularly edit station stories for the web, radio, and of course this fine show, Texas Standard. And we also provide coaching and training for all of our journalists across the state. And if you are a frequent public radio listener, you know we also have 6 statewide newscasts a day, including the one at the half-hour mark in this show. And we have an excellent weekly newsletter, Oye Texas. So just wanted to get in a plug for that.
Of course, one of the big things we're looking to in the new year is the legislative session. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so this will be the 5th legislative session that Texas stations will be covering as a team. We've got dozens of reporters across the state who will be involved. They'll each be following a specific issue or bill. And then, of course, we have our new state capitol and government reporter, Blaze Gainey, and he will be at the State House every day, providing listeners with all of that behind-the-scenes look at what lawmakers are doing. And there are a lot of big things on our radar going into the session. And of course, one of those is education. And that includes a top priority for Governor Abbott, a voucher-like plan for public schools, which no doubt you have heard about. And in general, of course, education is a big focus for us at the Texas Newsroom. So since this is a Texas Newsroom highlight show, we are going to kick it off there. Only about a quarter of Texas teachers are men, and state data from last year shows the number of male teachers who are Black or Latino is even smaller. In February, KERA's Zara Amaechi reported on a residency program in Dallas ISD that is helping to bring more men of color into the classroom.
De Jesus Arafuya is getting his 3rd grade language arts class at Daniel Webster Elementary School ready for the day.
Bring it back, bring it back. Just like that. Bring it back. Just like that. Ariana, can you stand up and tell me?
Arafuya sees himself as more than a teacher. He acts as a father figure to the students. His approach is shaped by his experience as a primary school student in Nigeria, where he was often disciplined for behavior issues.
But then when I finally had a male teacher, the male teacher is like, oh yeah, he understands that, the energy is different.
For many of Arafuya's students, he's likely the first male teacher they've encountered, and more specifically, the first Black male teacher.
My presence here is more than just
a black man teaching, it means more to these students who can now see someone who looks like them. So now it goes from just teaching to now inspiring.
Black male teachers like Arafuya make up less than 2% of all teachers nationwide, even though 15% of the student population is Black. It's not much better for Latino men. They're about 10% of all teachers. To combat those numbers, Dallas ISD created a Black and Latino male residency program. Since it started in 2020, the program has brought in more than 200 new teachers.
We bring in individuals who, their background is not education, but they have the passion to be in the classroom.
That's Steven Jackson, Dallas ISD's Director of Recruitment. When he pitched the program, the district only had about 950 Black and Latino teachers combined.
When it came through, I was here and they asked me to go ahead and see who we can recruit, and we recruited a lot of individuals. We had maybe about 600 applications during that time.
Jackson switched to education after a career in media production. He went through the Teach for America program and became a special education teacher. Jackson says growing up, it was his male teachers who encouraged him to consider teaching as an option.
They taught me how to be a man. I could go and talk to those teachers because I knew I could relate to them, and they could relate to what's going on with me and in my life.
Researchers have found that although having a male teacher doesn't necessarily impact a student's academic performance, it does impact how students see themselves, their sense of belonging, and their own academic drive and determination. The 2-year-long residency program places African American men in elementary schools and Latino men in high schools. That's where the need is greatest. About 70% of Dallas ISD high school students are Latino. Felipe Cruz was completely new to teaching when he entered the residency program. He now teaches math to juniors at Thomas Jefferson High School. The school has a newcomer program for students who have lived in the United States for 3 years or less, meaning some students are still learning English. Some of Cruz's students have to provide for their families and in some cases even pay their own rent. He says education might not be a high priority.
And those stresses of trying to stay in the education process, they don't see the value in it. So when you have somebody that is Latino that understands the process, and I'm able to communicate that to them.
Both Cruz and elementary school teacher De Jesus Arafuya know they took on a big responsibility when they decided to become teachers.
The students basically will emulate what they see. And if you're a great role model, they will want to model their lives to become just like you or better.
Dallas ISD is currently recruiting for its 8th cohort of teachers. I'm Zara Amaechi in Dallas.
In Texas and in other parts of the country, the word maverick gets tossed around quite a bit. It's been used as the name of fictional characters to denote their independent or rebellious nature. Think of the Tom Cruise character of Maverick in the movie Top Gun. But there was a real Maverick who was known for being a political wildcard from San Antonio in the 1930s. In a story we broadcast in June, Texas Public Radio's David Martin Davies showed us how Maury Maverick was a national celebrity in the heyday of radio.
Information, please. Presented each week at this time by Canada Drive.
From 1938 to 1951, Information Please was a popular radio quiz show where listeners mailed in questions to try to stump a panel of experts. Guest panelists often included celebrities, and on July 25, 1938, here's how the host, literary critic Clifton Fadiman, introduced their guest expert.
And our guest of honor is an expert on a great many things, including the fine old tradition of American liberty. Formerly a member of Congress in Texas, he is now the hard-hitting mayor of San Antonio. I introduce to you the author of In Blood and Ink and the bearer of a name famous in the history of the Southwest, Maury Maverick.
I think these people are trying to frame me, the country boy coming to New York City.
I thought it was very interesting as an artifact.
Louis Fisher is a historian and author of Maverick, the American name that became a legend. He says this old radio recording shows a different side of Maverick.
He's thought of a lot of times as a lot more bombastic than that. Now, I suppose he could be when he was giving political speeches. And in this show, he was more laid back, almost a genteel banterer, which is not the sort of image usually associated with him.
On the air, Maverick was asked about his famous family name.
You want me to tell the story right? Well, I'll tell it for you.
Yeah, tell it right, but tell it short. Mr.
Okay. My grandfather was named Samuel A. Maverick. He took in 453 head of cattle, and they were in the hands of a colored slave, and he wouldn't brand them, so they called him Maverick's cattle, and that's all there is to it. He never was a cattleman, like people say. And also, there's another thing. He only branded his own cattle. Some people say that he branded everybody's cattle, but he only branded his own.
And Maverick was quizzed about his knowledge of politics.
Now, since the Civil War, have there been any Democratic presidents who received a majority of the popular vote? A majority. And if so, who? You'll have to, Mr. Maverick.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, and any other?
I don't think so.
Right. Absolutely right.
That would have been an easy question for Maverick. During his 2 terms in Congress, he was an ardent champion of Roosevelt's New Deal.
Sometimes even to the left of Roosevelt.
Fisher said Maverick was a novelty for the New York-based radio show, and he was known for more than just his name.
He was a fairly sought-after speaker, which took him all across the country. He spoke on a lot of liberal subjects, civil liberties. He was the only Southern congressman who voted for the anti-lynching law.
But Fisher said Maverick showed on the air that he was also entertaining.
Sure is. Now, Mr. Maverick, they'll like that over here. What is the activated sludge process?
Well, I'm going to answer that question because I'm sure that nobody's going to know when I'm wrong.
I've got it
I think there's something about the sewer system.
Do you have any sewage problem in San Antonio?
Well, now we have a politically...
never mind.
There's a lot of truth to Maverick's joke, Fisher said. As mayor, he worked to clean up a city that was known for being thoroughly politically corrupt, including the police chief, Owen Kilday. Kilday is remembered for his brutality, especially during the famous pecan sheller strike.
As Maury Maverick was being sworn in as mayor, and he had his right hand raised, as he lowered his hand, he pointed to Kilday and said, "You're fired."
Now, for what purpose, under a prudently and soundly administered municipal government, such as the ones we have in New York and in San Antonio, are long-term borrowings justified?
Long-term borrowings are only justified for permanent improvements which must be paid over a long period of time. You must not have long-term borrowings for current obligations.
Very good, very good. Now, you can rerun for mayor anytime you wish. Quite all right, Maverick.
Maverick did run for re-election, and he lost. Lewis said Maverick was branded a communist by his political enemies. After his tenure as mayor, Maverick continued to be involved in civic and political activities until his death on June 7, 1954. I'm David Martin Davies in San Antonio.
You're listening to a special edition of the Texas Standard, some of the best stories of 2024 from the Texas Newsroom. There's more just ahead. Stay with us.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Oncology, right here with cancer care at more than 280 locations around Texas, allowing patients to remain close to family, friends, and caregivers while they fight against cancer. More at texasoncology.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Over the last few years, Texas has lost more rural hospitals than any other state, and many counties lack adequate primary care services. In response to the challenges faced by rural communities and disaster-stricken areas, mobile health clinics are rolling out to provide vital medical services. Alexis Jones of KACU reported in July on how these clinics could help residents of the Big Country in Texas and beyond.
On a recent sweltering day in Abilene, local officials watch as 2 people assemble what is essentially a mobile health clinic in the parking lot of the West Central Texas Council of Governments in less than 20 minutes. Once the structure was built, leaders from across the Big Country file into the unit for a sales pitch and much-needed AC. The idea of the mobile op unit was born in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as a way to respond to emergency challenges. Mobile health clinics aren't exactly new, but this particular model is unique because it unfolds from a compact 2.5 feet into a structure that can withstand hurricane-force winds while serving as everything from a medical care facility to a command center or even temporary housing.
The main problem was always real estate. Where do you actually set up at and have something set up? So these units take up only about 2.5 feet when they're folded up, so they'll take up any real estate. But when you need them, they fold back out.
That's Rick Pearson, head of design and development at the Dallas-based Mobile Op 4. Pearson says that the units are made out of recycled material and can be customized to each consumer's needs. Mobile Op 4 founder Jeff Blankenship made it clear that these units would augment healthcare in communities where they're needed most, not take away current resources.
Working with the border now, and the Border Patrol is very interested in our modules as well, not just for isolation rooms or detention, but also for they can be converted into housing.
The units can be used in various scenarios, from natural disasters to community events like concerts and fairs. They weigh under 2,000 pounds, allowing for easy towing by regular vehicles, and can function with local power or generators. Already, the modules are attracting attention from schools and rural areas lacking in adequate medical facilities. Ted Matthews, interim CEO of Anson General Hospital, said that the mobile units could add to the hospital's existing services.
We have clinics there and we have our emergency room there. But I could see on a countywide basis or perhaps even a community-wide basis where 2 or 3 entities could go in, and if we reach that point where we need that rapid response, we could team up both from the hospital as well as where the incident took place out there and set this up shortly.
Mobile Op is even working with companies like Samsung that are rethinking healthcare.
We're working with them because they're going to be utilizing our module. Samsung is developing hospitals of the future with their technology and their TVs. So we're very actively involved with different other companies that are revolutionizing hospital to the home.
The issue of needing better preventative measures and more state support for rural health care remains a problem. But it seems to be getting better thanks to ideas like Mobile Op 4. In Abilene, I'm Alexis Jones.
Support for Coverage of Business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' comp carrier dedicated to handling claims proactively to help injured employees get back on the job and policyholders get back to business. More at texasmutual.com/claims.
And you are listening to the Texas Standard. San Antonio puts on a rodeo each year that's hundreds of years in the making, actually. Has little to do with country music and barbecue, and a whole lot more to do with a Mexican tradition that's taken deep roots in the American Southwest. These rodeos are called charreadas. In May, Texas Public Radio's Jack Morgan took us inside.
It's Sunday morning, and after last night's big cloudburst, everyone scrambles to make this specialized rodeo arena in South San Antonio safe for the horses and riders. Edmundo Rios III looks at the inches of mud and rolls his eyes.
Terrible. We're going to go check it again right now.
Have you had it this bad before?
Oh, yeah. It's not the first time we've been through this before.
This is the 28-year-old's 23rd charreada. Rios knows what to do with the standing water and sandy arena. A tractor pushes water and mud away, and they dump and burn diesel fuel to try to burn off the remaining puddles. After hours of effort, Mexican and American national anthems are sung as the sun finally breaks through. The anthems give way to mariachi tunes, and various folklorico dance groups perform on a stage for the crowd. They're dressed in colorful traditional Mexican costumes, a thick gold sash and flowing dresses that reflect sunlight as they twirl and spin. Nearby, horseback riders in ornate outfits called traje de charros, all wearing wide sombreros, slog through the mud, lessons now by sunny skies. Riders thrill the crowd with their intricate horsemanship, stepping in highly synchronized routines. 2 riders trot by, one holding the Stars and Stripes, the other the Mexican national flag. Laura Hernandez-Applin brought her husband and 2 kids.
It's just gorgeous, beautiful. I love the colors. I love seeing the Mexican flag next to the United States flag. There was something special about just honoring both countries, and I absolutely adore our ancestry and our history tied to that.
This kind of rodeo long predates those of the American West. These charreadas' roots go way back to the Mexican haciendas, the big ranches established by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. A team of 8 young women circle the small arena, then turn and converge on one another in a collision course, but somehow the 1,000-pound horses and their riders miss each other by inches at the center, before forming an outside circle once again.
We have to communicate with our horse very well as communicate with our teammates very well to avoid crashing into each other.
34-year-old team leader Lauren Fierro Martinez began riding when she was 11, but then she got into the side saddle, or escaramuza style of riding they do here.
I definitely learned better horsemanship and how to be a better rider from doing escaramuza.
As these women ride complicated patterns weaving in and out from one another, they're riding side saddle, wearing dresses with ruffled petticoats. 26-year-old Yasmin Bernal has been riding with the San Antonio team since she was 9.
It was like a crash course of escaramuza.
Crash course is a bad phrase to use when it comes to this kind of riding, isn't it?
Yes. Technically, it was more of like an anti-crash course.
The San Antonio Charro Association, charro means cowboy, was built in 1947. Edmundo Rios II, one of the team's longest-running riders, now directs the nonprofit.
I'm going on 60 years this year, 60 years old. So I've been around 45, 50 maybe. We started off as a parade group, and little by little, we got into the charreria, to all the events and everything. And right now, we are the 2023 state champs.
The charro teams compete all over the Southwest and even in Mexico. He says he's proud of serving the charreada tradition that goes back to the 1500s.
It was a big party. It's family-oriented and passed down from generation to generation.
Writer Yasmin Bernal says this sport, which reflects the deepest traditions of Mexico, is actually a metric of American strength.
I feel like embracing different types of cultures is a big part of what makes America great, because we're all different and we're all able to coexist.
While most think soccer is the national sport of Mexico, in fact, it's charreada. And for the some 4,000 at this arena in South San Antonio, what's old is new again. I'm Jack Morgan in San Antonio.
You're listening to some of the best feature reporting in 2024 from our public media partners statewide at the Texas Newsroom. There's a whole lot more coming up after we check in with the Texas News Roundup. That's next, here on The Standard. Stay with us.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas ABLE program, helping eligible Texans with disabilities save and plan for the future to pay for qualified disability expenses with a tax-advantaged ABLE account. Learn more at texasable.org.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Alexandra Hart. Authorities have identified the suspect accused of driving his car into a mall in Killeen while trying to escape from police. 53-year-old John Darrell Schultz of Kempner is accused of leading police on a 19-mile-long chase Saturday night that ended when he crashed his car through the glass doors of a department store. Sergeant Brian Washko with the Department of Public Safety says officers got out of their vehicles and continued the pursuit.
The trooper and the Killeen police officer continued on foot after this vehicle, which was driving through the store, actively running people over.
Schultz died after being shot by officers. 4 people inside the store were injured. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has sued the NCAA for allowing transgender athletes to compete in women's sports. Paxton alleges the college sports agency engaged in false, deceptive, and misleading practices in sporting events that included transgender athletes and were marketed as women's competitions. Paxton requests that a court prohibit the NCAA from allowing transgender athletes to compete in women's games in Texas or involving any Texas teams, or to bar it from marketing these events as women's sports. Drone sightings along the East Coast and recently in North Texas near some sensitive military facilities have caused a stir in the media for the past several weeks. Chris Combs is an associate professor in aerodynamics at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He says that most of the sightings are likely regular aircraft being misidentified.
So the vast majority of these, I think, are just confused and uninformed members of the public that are a little bit scared because of what they've been hearing on the news. If you see blinking red and green lights on one of these objects, that's a really good chance it's just a regular drone or airplane.
Government officials have stated that the drones are not a threat to the public. From now until January 5th, bird lovers will convene across Central Texas and beyond to take part in the 125th annual Christmas bird count. The events celebrate birds and track how their numbers have changed over time. John Bloomfield is the board president of the Travis Audubon Society and says one recent study showed a 30% decrease in the North American bird population since the 70s, due largely to human causes.
So that can range from habitat loss due to overdevelopment, the effects of climate change, even the effects of noise and light.
Bloomfield says events like this help raise awareness and understanding that help protect birds. You can find a list of upcoming bird counts in your area at audubon.org. I'm Alexandra Hart from the Texas Newsroom.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station today.
33 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard Time. I'm David Brown. A small cemetery in far west Texas has held the remains of indigenous residents for centuries, but until recently, it was nearly abandoned. In 2021, the city and county of Presidio made the historic decision to give the land to the Lipan Apache tribe of Texas. And since then, a coalition of conservationists, descendants, and architects has worked to create a memorial at that burial ground. This spring, they completed it. In April, Marfa Public Radio's Annie Rosenthal took us on a tour of the site.
For years, descendants of the people buried in El Cementerio del Barrio de los Lipanes had one goal. Cristina Hernandez, who's been visiting her ancestors' graves since she was a kid, says it was a modest one.
There were four-wheeler tracks all through the cemetery. There was trash and broken beer bottles from some late-night happy hour. We really thought that we could just fence the property to keep it safe.
But as the effort gained momentum and supporters, from the Big Bend Conservation Alliance to the city government, Hernandez and other descendants started to dream bigger. And 3 years later, the site is almost unrecognizable. Before, it was an unmarked lot. Now, the first thing you see from the street is a huge welcoming pillar and a sign that reads,
which just means Bienvenidos a este lugar sagrado, or welcome to this sacred place.
That's Dr. Nakaya Float. She's an anthropologist from Presidio and Ojinaga whose ancestors are also buried here. Float is the one who wrote the signage for the memorial. Beyond the welcome sign, there's now a state historical marker. And she points out other panels.
So this is talking about life and death in Lipan Apache culture. Here I talk about how you shouldn't really mention that person's name when they just passed away. But then after that, it's common to go visit and pay respects to them to wherever they're buried.
As the protection project developed, even the idea of a fence got more complex. Float says the descendants wanted the space to feel welcoming. And right here, where you can see straight across the Rio Grande to Mexico, they didn't want the protective structure to feel like a border or a wall. That's where Mayra Udvardi comes in.
We wanted to make sure that we were creating a porous barrier that would keep the burial mound safe.
Udvardi is an architect with Mass Design Group, a firm focused on what they call healing architecture. Walking through the cemetery, Udvardi shows me the design they settled on. Short stretches of wall that wrap around the site, offering the visitor a clear path without fencing you in.
Once we pass through the threshold, the path widens and gives us an opportunity to approach a pile of sentinel stones that's in the first corner of the undulating gabion wall.
The walls themselves are made of these sentinel stones, which are exactly what their name suggests, says Cristina Hernandez.
They are here to guard and preserve remains.
At the top of the burial mound, she points out a grave covered in these same round rocks.
So we are standing next to my great-great-grandfather and his brothers, and they're the only graves within the cemetery that have their names.
For decades, Cristina and her family were some of the only people regularly tending to the site. Cristina's dad, Juan, says they saw that sentinel stones from the graves were disappearing.
Some had been taken. People had them as yard decorations and stuff like that. It was crazy.
Recently, local conservationists and city officials went door to door, asking neighbors to return the stones.
The cleanup was just amazing to see children, people older than myself, out here carrying rocks and placing the rocks back on top of the graves.
And this spring, Presidio teachers have brought students out here to learn about the cemetery. That means a lot to Juan. His ancestors were forced to assimilate to survive here. Now, thanks to this memorial, he thinks a new generation finally has a chance to talk about that. And they no longer have to pick between heritage and home.
Seeing them excited about this and learning about what is their culture, I think it's a great thing.
The protection project is now complete, but there is one part of the cemetery that's still evolving. As you walk down the mound from the graves, you come to an empty stretch of ground and a bench.
You don't mind if I sit?
That's Chochi Nayapiltsin. He grew up in Alpine, and he's among the elders here working to recover his indigenous heritage.
We're sitting here at this beautiful site of what's been dedicated as the repatriation part of the Cementerio de Barrio de los Lipanes.
The cemetery may now be the best recognized indigenous burial site in far west Texas, but it's not the only one. Over centuries, people have unearthed Native people's remains around the region, including some remains that share Nayapiltsin's DNA.
A lot of our ancestors right now are resting, if you will, in places that are not actually cemeteries, but we're hoping to bring them home now.
Nayapiltsin is working with tribes and institutions like universities to get those remains returned. That effort's still taking shape, but even now Nayapiltsin says he's glad people can come to see the site. He says it has a message for visitors.
We're still here, taking care of them. It is still our responsibility as stewards of this land.
That work has been happening here for decades, quiet and nearly invisible. But now, walking the path this community has laid through the cemetery, it's impossible to miss. In Presidio, I'm Annie Rosenthal.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Raise Your Hand Texas, working to strengthen public education for all students and helping Texans understand education issues, coming up during the 89th legislative session at raiseyourhandtexas.org.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. We're listening back to some of the most memorable stories of 2024 produced by our partners with the Texas Newsroom, a collaboration of public media reporters statewide. And without a doubt, one of those stories dealt with an issue most of us have faced at one time or another, the loss of a pet. Back in August, our executive producer asked us to share pictures of our past pets to go along with this next story, which we must warn you is a bit of a tearjerker. It asks, in a literal sense, what happens to our pets when they die? In Texas, they're often buried in the backyard. But as KUT's Stephanie Federico reported, some are given a burial in a proper cemetery.
A while back, I went over to Liz Henry's house in northwest Austin. We stood in her kitchen looking at photos of her childhood pets. A photo of her when she was 3, beaming as she held her dog Jigger.
That's Jigger, me holding Jigger way down there in the corner.
In another photo, Jigger is lapping Kool-Aid from a cup.
There she is dressed up. She's got a bonnet on. Yeah.
As a child, Liz would dress up the Chihuahua Terrier mix and push her around in a stroller. Jigger would eventually jump out and run away, but she was pretty cool about it. Liz's cat, Shanghai, shows up in later years. A typical Siamese, Shang had his quirks.
He loved playing the piano in the middle of the night and wake us all up.
Liz turns the page and there are more photos of Jigger. This time, she's lying in a 3-foot-long box with the lid propped open. A spray of white flowers sits on the ground in front. Jigger was buried in 1974 in the Pet Rest Cemetery in Pflugerville. Shang would join her almost 10 years later. Liz's parents bought side-by-side plots and tombstones made of Texas granite. Back then, the cemetery was called Pet Rest Memorial Park. Liz visited a few times throughout the years, but it had been decades when she returned in 2021.
It didn't look like they were taking new animals or doing anything. It looked like they pretty well shut up their doors and gone away.
Dan Seligman drove by the cemetery from time to time. He noticed the same thing.
Just always glanced over, just thinking, well, there it is.
Then bulldozers showed up.
Well, now it's not.
So Dan asked, AT explained, what happened to the animals? He says it would have been great if the animals were removed, but if so, where to? If his pet were buried there, he would want to know what happened to the body.
Probably wouldn't be anything to dig up and take home. I'm sure plenty were buried in cardboard boxes, kind of a ashes to ashes, dust to dust sort of thing.
Texas law says you can't build on top of a cemetery for humans. Any sort of construction requires the graves to be relocated.
But maybe because they aren't people, there's no rules about it.
He's right. Pets are considered property in Texas. They aren't afforded the same dignity as humans when they die. So what happened to the bodies? To answer Dan's question, I reached out to the last owners of the cemetery. I left several messages, but they didn't respond to my request for an interview. Pet Rest had been around since the 60s. There was a 2-story house on the property. The owners actually lived there. Most of the markers were flat on the ground, but there were also headstones and other memorials. The price to bury a pet varied depending on an animal's size and what it was buried in, if anything. A cardboard box, a styrofoam container, an actual coffin. Liz's dog may have been buried in the liner of a child's casket. Nothing in the papers Liz showed me promised the animals would be there forever. The property was sold in 2021. The owners were both about 70 then. A good time to call it quits. I went out to the site just before Christmas. It hugs a busy intersection across the street from a U-Haul rental place. In the distance, you can see the Welcome to Pflugerville water tower. There definitely aren't any smokestacks. I stopped by the construction company next door to the property to see if anyone knew what happened. One guy just smirked and said the animals were all respectfully removed and relocated. Another employee said the company had bought the property about a year ago to expand. He showed me where the cemetery used to be. Now there's just a square, 1-story building on green grass behind a black fence. He estimated there were around 1,000 animals buried there. His company has all the tombstones out back. They put out a notice saying families could come by and pick them up, as well as any remains. So Liz went out to collect her pets' headstones.
We were glad we found them, and we just put them in our flower bed out back, so there they are. Yeah, and I think my parents would be glad we did that too.
She has no hard feelings. Progress is progress, she says. Back at the construction company, I asked a worker if I could take a look at the tombstones. He suddenly decided I needed to talk to his boss. But it was clear during a phone call later that the boss didn't want to talk to me, and neither did the boss's boss. All they would say is that they hired a contractor for the expansion, and that it was creepy working next door to a cemetery. So nobody wanted to tell me what happened to the bodies. The former owners of Pet Rest didn't want to speak to me. The construction company bosses wouldn't tell me. I decided to bring in Dee Dee Hawk.
I'm a medium and animal communicator.
Maybe the animals would speak to her.
There's still animals here. I'm picking up that someone did come across this property and purposely pulled up all the gravestones and just left the animals here.
I hadn't told Dee Dee anything about what I'd learned so far. On that day, she sensed the outline of what had been the cemetery, and a little girl looking for a dog named Charlie, but not much else. No animals spoke to her. Dee Dee believes when animals die, they level up and go to another plane. Sometimes they come back to check in on their people.
Just like if you were to talk to people out loud, past family members out loud. Same thing with pets. If you speak to them out loud, they'll kind of chime in and be like, "Yes, you rang," and hang out with you.
She understands wanting to bury a pet in a cemetery. It's a way to tell complete strangers this animal existed. This animal meant everything. This animal was loved. Also,
for me, it's respect for the animal and for the life. So I feel like burying them, returning them back to the earth is where they would want to be.
This story got me thinking about my own 2 cats. They're getting old, and every time one of them throws up, I'm like, is this the end? People with this, what's called anticipatory grief, often seek the support of Nicole Vicacall. She's a licensed social worker in Austin who began specializing in pet loss after her cat Cecil died.
People say, there's no roadmap. I need a book on how to do grief. A lot of people get kind of blindsided. And so I help people navigate for themselves how to make meaning out of the loss.
Pets are our chosen family, so losing one can be devastating. You don't just get another cat. Her goal as counselor is often to help people connect with their pets spiritually.
How can they transition their relationship to still carry this pet in their heart?
I asked Nicole why anyone would get a pet knowing they're probably going to die before us. She said our brains may not be able to fully grasp that we're going to outlive them. But also, pets are the reason a lot of people get up in the morning.
As lovely as humans and people are, we can hurt each other. We hurt each other physically and emotionally. And pets are not like that, you know? We can really truly trust them. And I think we can open up and bond and just be ourselves, and they can comfort us in a way. They don't try and give us advice or change the way we feel. They're just with us.
So we get a pet, and we love that pet, and then the pet dies. But after a period of mourning, many of us do it all over again. And why? Maybe the answer is simple. Pets are just worth it. I'm Stephanie Federico in Austin.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Tuition Promise Fund and the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. More on how each plan can help families start saving for future college expenses is at savenowforcollege.org.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. You know, even in the city, wildlife surrounds us. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes we're only reminded by a fleeting glimpse or maybe a sound. It was that last thing that inspired KUT's Mose Buchel to work on this story back in June. It's a story about a nearly invisible creature you've probably never seen, but have most definitely heard.
It's a curse of radio reporters. If you hear something that's interesting, unexpected, different, you want to get that sound. It doesn't matter what time of day or what else you're doing, you want to capture it. I mean, what if you never hear it again, right? You got to get it. This happened to me just this spring. It was like 2 a.m. I was lying in bed trying to get back to sleep, and I heard this owl outside of our house. And I'm lying there, and I remember thinking, man, are you really going to do this? Are you going to go outside at 2 a.m. and record this owl? Of course I did. And I've got to tell you now, this story is not about the owl. It flew off. This is about this other sound that I accidentally recorded. It's this kind of squeaking, peeping, almost whistling, chirping kind of sound. If you have trouble hearing high pitches, you might not even be able to catch it. But it really stood out to me the next morning when I listened to this, and I decided I needed to know what this sound was. And I should say, this is a sound I had heard around my neighborhood before, going on walks at night or early in the morning, especially in the spring and early summer. And I had explored many theories. At first, I thought it was maybe baby birds, like peeping in their nest. For a while, I decided it was some kind of cricket. Or maybe it was geckos. I thought, I see a lot of those in my yard, so maybe. But after a few phone calls, I learned that all of those theories were wrong. And I found myself on UT campus in a place called the Frog Room.
So this is the Frog Room.
It's a warm, tiled room with shelves of terrariums, each with their own little frog habitat.
So the frogs you hear calling right now are actually poison dart frogs.
This is Tom Devitt. He's a UT prof and researcher who quickly ID'd the sounds in my yard as chirping frogs. In the frog room, he brought down a terrarium that looked at first like it contained nothing but a chunk of limestone.
So you can see that little guy there sticking his head out of that little hole in the limestone.
Yeah, there he is.
Yeah.
Really tiny. The frog was tan in color, spotted, maybe over an inch long.
A lot of people have never seen one, but they hear them all the time.
Tom calls them cryptic, small, good at hiding, hard to find. He says that's the challenge of researching them. They are really difficult to observe in the wild. There are also different species of chirping frogs around Austin.
This species is called the cliff chirping frog. They're a native species.
But Tom thought what I heard in my yard could be Rio Grande chirping frogs. They are more recent arrivals to Austin, maybe having come in from South Texas on potted plants. In a quieter space down the hall from the frog room, he explained that chirping frogs are not like most frogs you've heard of. For one, they don't need much water. That's how they can live in our yards. No tadpole stage for these frogs. They just lay eggs, and the young hatch directly from them as little frogs.
You then see parental care of the eggs, whereas, many other species would lay their eggs in the water and then leave.
In fact, the male frogs may actually be the primary caregivers.
They'll kind of sit on the eggs, move them around. I think they're typically just guarding them from predators.
If they find a tree or a rock, do they just stay there?
That's what we have no idea.
In fact, the more we talked, it became clear there's a lot we don't know about them, even though they're everywhere. Even those little sounds they make, Tom says it's not totally clear why they do it.
So they make kind of two types of calls. One is sort of a kind of a little trilling noise, but the main one that you hear is just kind of almost like an insect whistle or a chirp that kind of goes.
He says one sound is probably to attract mates, the other to guard territory. But again, he needs to study them to find out.
I want to know everything about these frogs and what it's like to be one. That's what I'm about.
And to do that, you need to find them. So that's how KUT photographer Michael Manassi and I ended up with Tom on a frog hunt at the Bracken Ridge Field Laboratory off Lake Austin Boulevard.
The reason that I come to this trail in particular to look for frogs is because it's this old quarry, and so there's this cliff face, and there's a lot of places for frogs to, take refuge.
This is just acoustically so pleasant.
I know, right?
There were bugs, wild animals rustling in the underbrush. At one point, a stream of water trickled over the rocks. But one thing we did not hear much of was chirping frogs.
Definitely, as it's gotten later in the season, they've started to come out less and less.
Fortunately, Tom is an expert.
Oh, there's one. There's a little tiny one.
How did you see this thing?
I was just hopping.
Was he moving?
Yeah, he moved. Yeah. Hey, I feel like there's a lot of pressure off.
Yeah, seriously, we did it. We did it. And that was just the first.
Oh, here's one. I'll just kind of point my stick. Oh, let me go in front of it. There's a little tiny one right there.
Tom spotted 4 or 5 that night, despite their reluctance to chirp for us. Some that he found were surprisingly very, very small, like half an inch.
That's so interesting because this makes me wonder if these are ones that hatched out this year.
Those little ones he let go, but he did collect one male to bring to the lab. His plan was to see if the frogs he had there would mate in captivity to learn more about their life cycle. He was also going to play different chirps for them, maybe shedding some light on what the sounds mean by gauging their reaction.
None of it may work, so you'll have to follow up with me.
So that was a few weeks ago now. I did follow up.
Hey, Mo.
Tom said the experiments this year did not pan out. He thinks he may have waited too long into mating season to gather the frogs, all of which he had now returned to the wild.
I think I was probably a good 2 months late by the time I got going.
He thinks they had probably already had a chance to mate. In fact, since the frog hunt, he kept wondering about those super tiny frogs we saw, becoming more and more curious about whether they were this year's brand new generation, freshly hatched from some hidden clutch of frog eggs in the forest.
I hate to kind of speculate too much, but it's not all that often that you see little ones, and we saw a couple of them, pretty quickly.
So, instead of answers, we finished this with one more question about the mysterious chirping frogs of Central Texas. Tom says he will try to find out more about them next spring when that strange squeaking sound again fills the air. I'm Mose Bouchel in Austin.
We're out of time for today's special broadcast, a partnership with the Texas Newsroom, but we'll be back tomorrow. Hope you can join us for something very special. I'm David Brown, wishing you all the very best from Austin.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.